Hi there, medical wildcats. I'm Joseph Guggenheim. I'm a 1972 alum of the medical school, and this month I'm starting a two-episode presentation on Lincoln Park, that large recreation area just north of the Chicago campus. It was originally a city cemetery in the 19th century. In the 20th and 21st century, it is now Chicago's playground. Let's look at the size of Lincoln Park. Depending on which source you read, it's about 1,200 acres. This figure is from the Chicago Park District. I figure they know how much property they have. And you can see it's about 50% larger than Central Park in New York City, almost over twice the size of the country of Monaco, about 3 times the size of what I call the Grant Park complex. Grant Park proper, the museum campus, Millennium Park, and Maggie Daley Park, and about 10 times the size of the Vatican. I'd like to thank Professor Pamela Banos from our Evanston campus. I had the pleasure of going on a guided tour with her and several other alumni in 2019. She has done an amazing amount of research into Lincoln Park and says that what we see and often take for granted as truth is not supported by history. And she's done an amazing amount of research on the park. There are signs in Lincoln Park erected by her, and it's fun to walk from sign to sign and read the history of this park. There are some spooky legends about the Chicago cemetery, so let's talk about them in observance of Halloween. There are stories of ghost sightings, grave robbings, coffins and bodies floating down the Chicago River after heavy rains, a large mausoleum whose contents are unknown in the park. Human bones have been found during construction in the park and in the Gold Coast residential area, and there are probably thousands of bodies still present in the park. In early Chicago, the early white settlers buried their dead along the river or at a friend's house. In 1849, one of the Chicago newspapers reported 2 coffins floating down the river after spring rains. In 1835, which was 2 years before Chicago received its charter in 1837, 2 cemeteries were established. There was a North Cemetery, which went from Chicago Avenue on the south to Oak Street on the north, west to Green Bay Road, which is now Clark Street, and east to the lake. This did not include our campus because our campus at that time was still underwater before the landfill. And this cemetery contained the sites for about 20,000 shallow graves, primarily for Protestants. The South Cemetery was located at what is now 23rd Street, and it was primarily for Catholics. This is a map of the early North Cemetery, and starting at the top, you can see the horizontal street is North Avenue, which received its name because that was the northern border of Chicago at the time. And then Oak Street in the middle at the northern end of the cemetery, and Chicago Avenue at the south end. And you can see the lake starts at the edge of the cemetery. In 1837, 2 years later, the federal government gave a large tract of land that included Lincoln Park to the state of Illinois. The state of Illinois said that this must be used for burials, but said the town of Chicago could not use it for that until it was paid for. There were 60 acres here from the lake to what was called Green Bay Beach Road, now Clark Street. And you can see on this hand-drawn map, there are 4 horizontal lines to the west of this land. Starting at the top, there's Irving Park Road, and then Belmont, followed by Fullerton, and then at the bottom, North Avenue. So this triangular land was designated to be the graveyard, the new graveyard. The southern border, as I said, was North Avenue, and the cemetery was gradually extended northward. This is a map from 1863. This hockey stick-shaped black area in the upper end is what was called the 10-mile ditch. It was a drainage ditch from Evanston that emptied into Lake Michigan. Burials were begun at this new Chicago cemetery in about 1843, and interments in the old burial ground between Chicago and Oak Street were now forbidden. So bodies from the old cemetery were reinterred in this new cemetery from 1845 until 1849. There were several sections of this cemetery. One was called the Potter's Field, and this was the area for indigent deceased who were buried in the southeast corner of the cemetery, approximately where the Cardinals' residence is today. And you can see that at the red dot. So it was used for about 23 years. There was a prisoner of war camp at the southern side of Chicago where prisoners of war were kept, and many died in this area, and they were buried in the Potter's Field. Disinterments and headstone removals began in 1872, but the Potter's Field may still contain somewhere between 10,000 and 25,000 bodies. Cholera and smallpox victims were buried in shallow graves in the Potter's Field. And this notice from the Chicago Tribune basically said, get your friends and relatives out of the Potter's Field, or we will do it for you. Another section in the cemetery was the Catholic cemetery, and this was south of North Avenue, and you can see the red dots where it was. This was land that was purchased by the Chicago Diocese. The Catholic cemetery at first was bordered by North Avenue, Dearborn Street, West Burton Place, and North State Parkway, which was originally called Wolcott Street. This is the rectangle in the upper left part of this quadrant. It was later expanded to include all four of these rectangles, going south to Schiller Street and east to what was the lake at the time before the landfill, now Astor Street. From 1845 until 1849, bodies were reinterred from the old site between Chicago and Oak to this new site in the new Catholic cemetery. And many of these were later reinterred at Calvary Cemetery, which is the large cemetery you see if you drive north on Sheridan Road, just as you enter Evanston, and also St. Boniface Cemetery. There was a Jewish cemetery. In 1846, the first Jewish congregation in Chicago purchased a little under an acre from the city for $45. The reason I say approximately under 1 acre is because we don't know the exact size, but it was somewhere under an acre. This was located at the site of today's baseball fields in Lincoln Park. The eastern border was the beach at Lake Michigan, which shifted, so that may account for the difference in estimates of the size of the cemetery. Although it was established in 1846, the original deed was lost, and it was not until 1856 that it was reissued. There are no public records of the number of disinterments from the Jewish cemetery, but it's estimated there are about 1,500 bodies still there underneath the playground and the baseball fields. And you can see in this map where the Jewish cemetery was from 1845 until the 1850s. On the picture on the right, you can see the 1863 map overlaid the Google aerial map of the area, and you can see where the Jewish cemetery was compared to today's landmarks. There's an area called the Farwell property, and this was the property owned by the Farwell family, a prominent Chicago family who owned part of the land that later became our Chicago campus. You can see in the photograph a large sickle-shaped area coming out into the lake. And this is formed from the accumulation of sand in this area called accretion. And this is due to building piers and break fronts in the lake, causing the sand to accumulate in this area and adding many acres to Farwell's property. There was a structure called the Pest House. This was short for pestilence. It was at the southeast corner of the cemetery, probably where the Cardinals' residence is today. This housed cholera and smallpox patients. It was originally built in 1843, but had to be rebuilt several times because it burned down. In 1872, the Tribune reported that 2 patients had escaped from the pest house. So it was more of incarceration than hospitalization. It was finally demolished in 1874. There was another structure called the dead house. This was a term that was used until the 1880s to describe what we would probably now call the city morgue. Bodies would accumulate in this area until they were buried, and the citizens would complain about the odor. One of the aldermen complained about the odor because he said that the bodies were allowed to accumulate for 5 to 6 weeks before they were buried en masse, and the odor was sometimes intolerable. The city ordered the dead house to be removed in 1870. Many of the victims of the 1871 Great Fire of Chicago fled to escape, going northward to the city cemetery in the area that's now Lincoln Park. There were many grave markers that were destroyed. Some of the wooden ones were burned, others were trampled by the huge crowds, and some of them were cracked due to the heat. There are a couple of structures that still remain from the 19th century cemetery. One is this mausoleum above ground. It's estimated this is the oldest structure still standing from the 1871 Chicago fire area. It was erected in 1858, so well before the fire, for the wealthy Ira Couch, who died at age 50 while on vacation. It's unknown how many bodies are interred in this area. Some say it's just Ira, and others say there may be up to 13 family members. He owned the Tremont Hotel, which was a hotel at Lake and Dearborn Street in the theater district. It was a favorite of Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas when they were in Chicago. The mausoleum was estimated to weigh about 50 tons, which may account for the reason it was never removed. Other guesses are that Chicago was a prominent and wealthy, the Couch was a prominent and wealthy Chicagoan, so the mausoleum was left, or perhaps family members simply ignored the city's orders to remove it. In 1880, the newspapers reported ghost sightings at the mausoleum. And it was said that if you came to the mausoleum at the stroke of midnight, any night of the week, faced upward at the sign Couch over the door, and said 3 times, "The graves belong to the living, belong to the dead, not the living," the doors would open and a big white ghost would come out and greet you. I don't know if this legend is true or not, but look at the photograph on the right. There's another structure, the Kennison Boulder, which was left over from the early days. This is at Wisconsin and Clark Street. It's 1 block north of Kennison's actual grave. Kennison was allegedly 115 years old when he died. He looks pretty nice for 115 in this picture. He had 4 wives and 22 children. Because of his notoriety and fame, Chicago paid for his funeral and the gravesite. It is said he was the last survivor of the Boston Tea Party, and allegedly there is a vial of tea from the Boston Tea Party in the Chicago History Museum. There's a legend that there were grave robbers in the cemeteries, and they went by the euphemism of resurrectionists. And they were often students from Rush Medical College trying to obtain specimens for gross anatomy. In 1857, the city contracted with the Pinkerton Agency to monitor the city cemetery to try to thwart the removal of bodies from the cemetery. And a medical student from Rush was arrested, as well as Martin Quinlan, the city sexton. The city sexton was in charge of the burials. It is said that Quinlan did some private interments and pocketed the fees himself. Pinkerton, who owned the agency, was hired to catch the grave robbers, and one night he decided to play a practical joke on one of his employees by dressing up as a ghost and trying to frighten him as the employee watched for grave robbers. Rush College and Rush Medical School, as well as Lent University, which was the forerunner of our medical school, allegedly participated in the grave robbing. And in this quote from the Tribune in 1878, it says that Lent and Rush alternated nights robbing graves for specimens for anatomy. John Rauch was a prominent physician and public health expert who opposed continuing the burials in this area. He had his conclusion right, but his reasoning was wrong. He thought that diseases were caused by miasmas, which were bad odors, and arising from the cemetery, these were dangerous to the nearby residents. The burials were below the water table, so the bacteria from the dead could leak into Lake Michigan, contaminating the city's water supply. So he was opposed to contaminating the water, but he thought that the diseases were spread by odors. In 1858, he recommended discontinuing future burials in the city cemetery, but he just said nothing about the moving previously interred bodies. The last lots were sold in 1859. Rauch estimated that there were over 15,000 burials in the cemetery in the 6-year period between 1859 and 1865. He favored what were called extramural interments, which were burials outside the city limits. The Potter's Field and families who already owned grave sites were allowed to continue their burials, however. He suggested that the burial grounds could be used to plant trees, one of the early recommendations for turning this area into a park. Reinterments were carried out from this cemetery, which began in 1843 and ceased 23 years later in 1866. Bodies from the Potter's Field were reinterred at Oakwood Cemetery, completed in 1872, although there were probably many bodies still remaining. Catholics were reinterred at Calvary in the southern side of Evanston and St. Boniface. Non-Catholics were reinterred at Graceland and Rose Hill. According to Professor Banos, there are still more than 10,000 bodies underneath Lincoln Park. When you look at the size of Lincoln Park, which is about 12,000, that's about one body per acre, but there are probably no bodies in the northern end of Lincoln Park. She estimated that the total estimated burials between the Chicago and Catholic cemeteries measured 35,628, and estimated the bodies still remaining in the Potter's Field somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000. Total internments to other cemeteries were about 14,500. So there were about 8,000 bodies removed from the Potter's Field. But the important number to remember is that there were over 10,000 bodies probably still in Lincoln Park and the Gold Coast area. There was an archaeological excavation at Lincoln Park in 1998, which revealed the remains of 81 individuals. The most common reason for the graves being left behind was that they no longer can be found because the gravestones and markers have been removed. In the city cemetery, the owners were responsible for the disinterment of their families' remains, but many just ignored this requirement. And missing grave markers, as I said, prevented locating abandoned graves. Human remains were found during construction during the 19th century along North State Parkway and North Astor, and in the 20th century found at the building site for the Chicago History Museum garage, and also the Chicago History Museum renovations. This confirms that a large portion of Lincoln Park and the Gold Coast was cemetery. This is an old map which now shows the 21st century discovery of bodies. Many have been found along North Dearborn Street during construction. This map shows only a small portion of the sites where human bones have been found in the Gold Coast. This is a Google map overlaid with a 1865 map of the cemetery and the Gold Coast. The yellow dots represent where human remains have been found. The rectangle in the lower part of the picture below what says North Avenue is the residential Gold Coast area, and you can see the density of where human remains have been found recently. I'd like to thank Professor Pamela Banos at our Evanston campus, and also the Chicago History Museum, the Chicago Park District, and the Chicago Public Library for their assistance with this presentation. I love this picture of Lincoln Park looking south at dusk as the foliage changes in the fall. It's a beautiful park. So let's get together again virtually next month for part 2, where I'll be talking about the conversion of the cemetery to Chicago's recreational area.